Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Young. I'm Ethan's operating partner, and today Omar, Halabieh, and I will have a fireside chat and live Q&A on the topic leading a high-performing org and improving your cross-functional acumen. For background, Omar is the director of software engineering at Amazon, leading the technology function for payments across the Middle East and Africa. Omar is also a LinkedIn top voice, is very passionate about F1 racing, and his favorite pastime is spending quality time with his family. Welcome, Omar. Good to have you.
Great to be here, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Great. And for the live attendees, if you want to ask a question, just raise your virtual Zoom hand and I'll call you and then ask away. Okay, Omar, to dive right into it, so let's first tackle building and leading high-performing orgs. So first question, besides financial impact, how do you actually measure if you have a high-performing org?
Sure, it's a great question. I look at it from sort of multiple dimensions and lenses. Maybe the first one I'll start off is when I look at the leader of the organization, the way I look at it is the team is better off for having you, meaning in terms of the value that you incrementally add to the team, but they don't need you to function. They're able to operate autonomously. So I feel like that's sort of one litmus test that I would apply. A few others that also come to mind, I think looking at how much of the work that the team is doing and the efforts that we're spending are sort of proactive in nature versus being reactive. Over time, you want to get sort of more on the proactive side than the reactive side, although at times you may start out with one and gradually shift towards the other. I look at outputs that are maybe more qualitative in nature, maybe as opposed to necessarily quantitative. So things like feedback from stakeholders, from customers, etc., that give us signals. On the people front, I would look at things like engagement in some way that it's measured within the organization, looking at people's growth and development, whether horizontal or vertical, looking at things like talent inflow, particularly in large organizations where talent is very mobile, looking at how many people are joining our organization versus in some sense leaving. I would look at the quality of the discussions that are happening within the team. How's the communication flow? Ideally, it shouldn't be like everything is just funneling to the leader. There should be, in some sense, communication flowing freely within the entire organization. Like, say, somebody from one of my direct reports immediately reaching out to one of my other direct reports if they have an issue, a challenge, etc., versus everything kind of escalating just in one direction in that regards. Ability to surface disagreements, ability to have healthy debates, ability to hold each other accountable in a very kind way, I feel is also an important part. And then maybe if I had to add one more, it'll be really around the understanding of the why, like what each team member is working on. Do they understand why they're doing it? Why is it important? What value is it driving for customers? I feel like these are all signals of a high performing team. So you're kind of always looking for these cues to signal are things going in the right direction or where interventions are needed. So those are things at least I look for at a top level.
On the topic of communication, it reminded me of Jeff Bezos's one-way versus two-way door decisions, but
Yeah.
specifically when he said that the majority of two-way door decisions must be made by individuals or the ones deep in the organization working on the details. So that's another good sign. Okay, three follow-ups here that I noted.
Sure.
I agree. A proactive team is a sign of high performance. How do you, as the leader, how do you create a culture that people are proactive rather than reactive?
Sure. I think a couple of areas here that I mentioned, Jason. I think the first one is, do we actually have a strategy? Is it well, articulated? Is it well communicated? Is it bought into by the team? Because essentially for you to be proactive, you need to know what is it that we're working towards and trying to achieve. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then, of course, the strategy by itself is not good enough if it's not married with execution along those dimensions. So ruthlessly looking at where are we spending our time and effort. And I feel like as a leader, one of the key things that you need to do is also make sure that you drive focus in the organization. So how well are we aligned on basically working on the things that matter the most and then eliminating things that basically are not aligned with that strategy or things that are a distraction, because it's so easy to grab onto the next shiny thing or go into other directions as well. So that to me is probably another sign in that respect. And then lastly, I would say, especially when it comes to more of like operational matters, especially relevant maybe for tech teams, is making sure that in every area where we're spending time and energy on operations is like, solving the problem, but then really understanding, like, are we getting to the root causes? Are we investing enough to make sure that some of these issues that are surfacing are solved in a sustainable way, so that over time we're continuously actively reducing our operational reactive load? Because if you don't get that, just by the sheer growth of the business, these areas will only get bigger if you don't intentionally bring them down over time. So those are maybe a couple of areas that I would mention in this regards, and to constantly shift essentially from reactive to proactive. Yeah.
On the topic of making sure the team understands the why and that you're aligned on the same mission and goal, one thing that we commonly hear is there's a disconnect between sometimes leadership and then
Yeah.
those further away. How do you as a leader make sure that your team understands the why?
Sure. I think a few things that help, Jason, is basically not assuming in some ways that everyone understands the why. And so you have to think through that, like, you have to intentionally communicate it at every level of the organization, and using different mechanisms of communication and also repetition. And so you may think that, oh yeah, I basically talked to the team maybe 4 months ago, but then you don't realize, how many, for example, new people join your team, or for example, that people are dealing with so many other things that in the midst of everything else that is happening, the message that you communicated kind of fades away in the background. So I feel like these are important elements. And I feel that part of it is also making sure that the message is communicated in a consistent way, because it's also easy if you just leave the message to naturally sort of cascade through let's call it the hierarchy or the chain. By the time it gets to let's say the front line, the message may have not come through in the same manner. The intention behind it may have not come through. So I always like to make sure that, like, we either write things down or communicate more directly with all the organization at once, to just make sure that everybody is hearing the same message there. And then you obviously day to day inspect for things that maybe give you signals around, like, are things really being interpreted in the way? For example, you look at what decisions are being made, you look at what things are we prioritizing, because these all send you signals that if we're not doing that in a way that's consistent with our priorities, that means probably the priorities aren't well understood.
Three thoughts came to mind when you were talking on that point. The first is Sue Bathanis, who was Ethan's former executive coach. She says that the most important leadership trait is clear communication. So that hits exactly what you're talking about, because clear communication means clarity of thought. And then on the point of repetition and frequency, big plus one, there's a reason why in marketing you need to hit the same message at least 6 to 8 times. And then the third point that it reminded me of was Jensen Huang is quite famous for giving real-time feedback. Candid, brutally honest, real-time feedback in front of everyone in that moment. So if you don't see something that is in line with the culture or leadership principles at that moment, call it out as the leader. On this topic, one other follow-up question. Is there anything else you do to foster disagreement within your team? Because that's hard to do.
Sure. No, definitely. I think it's one of the hardest things to do, yet I feel is one of the most essential aspects of having a high-performing culture. I think for me, one is, in some sense, normalizing it and making sure everyone is on the same page in terms of understanding that disagreements are a good thing. That means we're pushing, we're trying to essentially, at least in the way that we think, deliver the most value to our customers. And so I think the first one is really working on that mindset and communicating it explicitly. Again, for you, it may be clear that, hey, this is a good thing. But again, for the teams, especially as you have people joining from different organizations, different backgrounds, etc., that may not come naturally in that respect, and quite the opposite. It may be something that within other organizations or cultures may be something that goes against essentially what's preached there. So I think that's one. I think the other one is really, in some sense, having some, I wouldn't say like forcing mechanisms, but something of that nature to make sure that, for example, in every document or discussions that we're having, putting a placeholder is like, what topics do you want to surface? What debates are you having within the team? And really encourage the team at every meeting to say, hey, if they brought one in, positively reinforcing that. If they didn't bring one in, to remind them. But I've made it in some ways like part of the standard templates that we use, whether we're having a monthly review or a goals review or a roadmap review, just to make sure that the team feels comfortable surfacing these things. And it's the way that we deal with them in the meeting in terms of discussing them in a very objective way. So I think these things just help normalize that as part of the culture. It does take intention, it does take effort, it doesn't come naturally, but as with any skill, like you start somewhere, and with the right signals, I think it just kind of builds a muscle in the organization around that.
I really like that question. You ask your team, what debates are you having, or what
Yeah,
debates have you had recently? That's a good, I'm going to put that in the swipe file as I'll take inspiration from you on that one. Which kind of brings me to the next question. You've touched upon this, but I'm curious if there's anything else. From your standpoint, is there anything else you've done differently with your org than you've seen other orgs to, foster this high performance culture?
sure. I think for me, maybe an essential element of that is I see that like the role of the leader is basically both to lead by example on the standard that you set and also continue to raise the bar. I feel like in some sense, one of your top priorities as a leader is really setting the standard for the team and over time continuing to raise that standard and then holding people accountable to that. I feel is like, it sounds basic, but it's arguably in some sense the most important job that you do. And what you'll find is like, no matter how high you set the standard, like your team will rise to the occasion, of course, with the right support, guidance, resources, etc. But I think there's like, we, in some sense, perhaps always underestimate what teams are capable of achieving, again, with the right environment, with the right support, etc. So I feel like that stretch and that raising of the standard, I think, is very important. And that's something that I actively take a look at, whether you're talking about standards of like what we expect of our team members in terms of their performance, in terms of their growth, or in the work that we're delivering, like what quality of work are we delivering, the quality of the solutions, etc. But I feel like having, we call it Amazon, like relentlessly high standards, I feel is so important for high performance culture. Otherwise, it's natural for sort of that sense of complacency to settle in once you've reached a certain level there. So how do you continue to kind of supercharge your team? I feel is probably one of the things that I find myself spending the most time in. I think the other one I would say, Jason, is like to be constantly observant in the organization, both with, set mechanisms, like you may have things like, one-on-one, skip levels, etc. But just in general, like dropping in, having casual conversations, coming in to see, like, for example, the demos our engineering teams are running, because every one of these interaction helps you pick up cues of things that are going well that you want to double down on, but also things that maybe you need to pay closer attention to in that respect. And I feel like those signals become so important to pick up. And especially as you grow sort of more senior, obviously you're more, let's say, further away from the front line. But it's so important to make sure that you're getting the signals that help you essentially adjust and adapt the organization accordingly.
On the topic of high standards, it reminded me of Ethan talks a lot about being unreasonable. And
Sure.
then in my chat with Wes Cow, she said one of the most important things she learned from Seth Godin was his incredibly high standards. So I agree that's the way to push your teams. Okay, so this I've always find this fascinating. When I look at reader comments on your LinkedIn posts, a consistent thread is you have strong mental models that are very tactical and actionable for people to put into place. So my question for you is, where does Omar get inspiration? Like where did you learn all of these mechanisms, frameworks, tips? Any books, people you follow, anything like that?
Sure. I think obviously in some sense, as with any like personal development, I always like to use the analogy like it really takes a village. Nobody gets there just by their sheer work individually. So I feel like I've been super lucky throughout my career to have guidance from a great set of mentors, both within organizations I've worked in, but also outside of it. So mentorship for me is something that I'm both passionate about as a mentee, but then as a mentor, given how much value it adds, especially because again, most of the time, like your mentors are a couple of steps ahead of you. And I always feel that in some sense, if you, let's say, fixate on coordinates that are further ahead, it helps you drive the things that make you get there perhaps faster and maybe in a better way than you would otherwise. So mentorship for me has played a key role and continues to do that. I think the other one is obviously reading. I feel has been an instrumental part of my growth and development, not only because of the, let's say, the content that you read and the information that you absorb, but I feel it's also a great reflection mechanism in terms of like, as you compare what it is that you're doing with, say, what are the authors of the books experienced, and you start to connect these threads in terms of things that maybe you were doing kind of more intuitionally, but then there's like some formal grounding to why it works and whatnot. So understanding that really helps you and helps maybe for you to have greater conviction that these are the right things to do in that respect. So books have been a great part. I think more recently, there's been an explosion of mediums to learn from, podcasts, online courses, etc. But I think overall, like the underlying theme, Jason, has been like following my curiosity has been a big one. And then as you drive with your curiosity, like curating your resources to help you get there and being intentional about your personal development. So as a leader, yes, your number one job obviously is to deliver results. But I feel like the other side of that coin is, I think this I picked up from Stephen Covey, like one of my earliest reads on the 7 habits of effective people is like that analogy of like sharpening your axe. So it's like, how am I like day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out is like, how are you investing in your personal development? Otherwise, like you'll reach a point where your capabilities just kind of like max out while your role continues to grow. That's not a spot you want to be in. So how are you continuously growing so that no matter how much your role grows, you're able to continue to keep pace, if you will. Yeah.
Is there a personal development book that you have gifted the most?
I would say there's maybe 2 or 3. The Dale Carnegie, like How to Win Friends and Influence People, is probably my most gifted book. One of the books that I always have multiple copies on hand to hand out to folks. It's been instrumental in the way that we connect, engage, build true, meaningful relationships. I know it's a little bit more on the personal side, but I feel in the workplace, the same exact dynamics operate there. Great way to build influence, etc. I would say the other 2 are probably what got you here won't get you there. I think for me is like the career almanac in terms of how to think about career growth and career development. So I feel that that's number 2, and probably number 3 would be Influence by Cialdini, because I think that as a leader, one of the most important skills to have is to be able to influence others. And influence is more like an outcome, but takes a lot of building block skills to get there. And I feel he does a great job of talking about that and teaching others on the topic.
Great book list. Okay, A. Stockler, I'm going to ask Omar one more question, and then we'll go to your hand raised question. Omar, you mentioned dropping in on your teams, going into demos, things like that to stay close. I had a question on how do you balance altitude shifting with your team, being a big leader, but wanting to stay close with the details. How do you decide when to do those things, or how do you fit it into your busy schedule?
Sure. I think for me, it's one of those areas, Jason, where over time you tune your judgment in terms of when to step in and when to go deeper. So there isn't really like a singular formula there, but I will share some elements at least that work for me. One that I already mentioned, which is leaning on curiosity. Sometimes I step in just purely because I want to learn and understand for myself the space better. So that could be sort of one input. I think the other one that I look at is like, what's the level of, let's call it challenge, risk, impact that basically is involved in the matter at hand. Obviously, like if we're doing something, for example, that hasn't been done, there's no precedence, or we're doing something that if it goes wrong, it could be majorly impactful to customers or things like that. Those are areas where you probably want to lean a little bit more into than being sort of just observing at a high level. I look at the experience of the team and the leader that I have that's managing this. And again, relating to the level of challenge, risk, and impact, because obviously you also have to use your judgment there in terms of the team's readiness and ability to handle there. And then the last one I would say is you look for what I would call like execution smells, right? Which are signs that are telling you that, hey, there may be trouble looming ahead. It may be like a missed milestone. It could be something we had to rework, etc. But you pick up some cues and you say, like, maybe it's time for me to step in. I feel like two very important elements as you do this as a leader. I think number one is setting the right expectation with your team that this is, hey, this is part of how I lead and how I manage, so that it doesn't get perceived as either, like, say, a micromanagement or maybe a lack of trust. So I feel like the more upfront you are about it, obviously, as you work with specific leaders and team members for a significant period of time, your team naturally understands that after a while. But I think especially early on in that dynamic journey, I think it's very important. And I would say the second thing that you do is by doing so yourself, you're basically leading by example so that your leaders also learn from you to drive something similar within their teams and their organizations. Because as with anything, this is a skill. And the more that your leaders are also doing it, it helps you in that regards as well. So those are the things I look for. Yeah.
When you do your drop-ins, are they impromptu surprise, Omar's here in the meeting, or do you give your team a heads up?
Generally, I do give my team a heads up in that regards. I feel like, and I'm also very cautious of making sure that I also tell my team, like, please don't prepare anything extra, because at times it may be that, for example, there's a whiteboarding session that's happening. But if the team thinks that I'm coming, then they may think like, hey, we need to go like write a fancy document or whatever else. But at times that's not necessary. So I feel like that, both letting them know, but also setting the right expectation, because ultimately you don't want to create more work for the team if it's not necessary.
Yep, I agree to that. Reduce churn as much as possible, because instead of truth seeking, your team may be manager playing, let's call it.
Totally.
I like your phrase execution smells. It reminds me of what Warren Buffett said, that there's rarely one cockroach in the kitchen.
Sure.
So if you
Sure.
find one, there's bound to be more.
And
On
by
the
the way,
top,
like this is not, I was just going to say that like this, since this relies on judgment, obviously you don't always get it right. There may be times when you go deep and it turns out in some sense it may not have been totally necessary. And then also on the flip side, there may be times where you don't pick up some of these cues and it ends up having some impact. But I think that ultimately, again, this is something you refine over time, but you should also be okay with the fact that sometimes you'll miss. And so continuing to refine it and take it forward, I think is an important aspect of this as well.
I agree. You also brought up the topic of trust, or
Yeah.
trust building, and then having belief in the team. What's the best way for someone to build trust with you? Let's say a new direct report. How do you like, what do you like to see?
Sure. I think for me, maybe like a couple of things that I look for. I think one is really like no surprises. And so for me, I'd like to make sure that my team is setting the right expectation with me, both in terms of their interaction with me, but also their interactions with others or what may be happening in the space, even if it's just informational. So I look for that judgment in terms of like, what do you surface to me? Obviously, you can't surface absolutely everything, but I look for, high judgment in terms of, hey, this may be impactful enough to where like you should know about this. even though they may be handling it themselves, I feel is an important element of that. I think the other one is, again, if there is maybe a change in plan or something has happened, I think early and often communication, I think, is an important part of that as well. So I think for me, I'm always looking for, again, like say what you do what you say, and minimize surprises is probably at the top of that list. I think we may have lost Jason. We'll just give him a minute to join.
Good to see you live, Omar.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it maybe is power, Mustin.
Yeah.
Maybe if somebody wants to ask a question, we can do that maybe while we wait for Jason.
Hi, Omar. It's A. Stockler. Jason referenced my question, my hand being raised. I was just wondering, when you were talking about high performance organizations and that high expectations, do you ever fear or guard against the opposite effect of having such high expectations and having your direct reports not start projects or just feel intimidated to get things going because you have such a high bar?
No, totally. I think that's definitely one aspect of it. I think for me, the analogy that I always sort of reference is one from, like, physical training, right? Where I feel like there's the statement about like progressive overload, right? Where understanding where the team is in that state of matter where you're looking to exercise is really around like, what's that stretch? Because obviously, if you set something completely unrealistic, that will act as you're either setting up the team for failure, or you're setting the bar so high that people, as you said, won't even attempt to do that. So I think that's where using your judgment to say, where do I set that bar right? Now, it doesn't always, you don't always get it perfectly right, but that's where also the team understanding that, as for example, the team finds out more and they come to you, how supportive are you in terms of helping them unblock, helping them figure out simplifications, or even saying that, hey, we need to revisit the goal because the goal we've set seems unreasonable basis what we now know versus what we knew before. So I think as long as you're able to showcase like setting that high standard, but at the same time, there's that level of support that the team knows they will get, I feel is important. And that's kind of the basis for what we generally call like psychological safety. But it does require active intention, because you're absolutely right in that if it goes to one extreme, I feel definitely could be detrimental to the team, taking risks, trying new things, etc.
Thank you for
Yeah.
Thank you for answering the question. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Aaron has his hand up.
I do. I guess we're self-moderating. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm not too good at Zoom either. So thanks for jumping in, folks. Yeah.
It's all good. We're a community of practitioners here. We'll figure it out. One of the questions I have, so like a good example, I have a mix of initiatives. Some are kind of easy, like build something that's pretty low risk. I have something pretty high risk. And sometimes there'll be a perceived bar because it's easier to obviously execute on the easier thing than the harder thing. One of the things I sometimes struggle with is helping upper levels of leadership, even in my company, understand the difference between those two things. Like how do you help people understand this high dive was a high difficulty dive, this one was a kind of easy swim, and avoid the bias of, well, they execute all the time. They're always, exactly doing what they say they're going to do because they chose the easier thing. Thank you for your time.
Got it. That's a great question. I think the first one that I try to do more on a proactive basis is, over time, ensure that I spend time educating, whether my leadership or my stakeholders on the space that we're operating in. Because ultimately, I feel like where those stakeholders and leaders understand more of what we deal with, I think they're much likely to both appreciate the work that's being done, but also your ability to influence them when it comes to decision making, investments, anything else of that nature. So I feel like educating there is a key element of this. And then I think when we're, let's say, evaluating our performance, whether as a team or as an individual, I think, as you kind of hinted to it, I always look at it from the perspective of like, what's the level of challenge or stretch that the team or the individual walked through and the complexity, and then what were we able to achieve in that respect. So think of it as almost, similar to how you would think about, say, an interview question, because just judging by the outcome is very difficult. Because again, if you're going from point A to point B, there's already a paved highway. It's not that difficult to do that transition. Whereas like if we didn't even know where point B was, or there's no road in terms of precedence of how to get there, then it's a much more difficult challenge there. So I think as you communicate also the achievements that the team has done, being clear on the journey, not just on the destination, over time helps also build that credibility and that track record, and helps build the right mindset with your stakeholders in terms of that level of challenge. Again, it takes sort of time to do that in terms of something that you do over and over again until it becomes second nature, both within the organization and then obviously with your stakeholders as well.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Jason's full house power and internet went out, so he's
Got it.
trying to join back in.
Sure.
I'm talking to him on Slack. I'll let you guys know. Okay?
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Omar, I'm Deepak. Good to meet you here virtually. I have a question on burnout. How do you sustain high performance without burning out, right? At an individual level and as a team level.
Sure. I think as an individual level, I feel like there's a couple of elements at least that help me, and I try my best both to model by example, because I truly believe that actions speak louder than words when it comes to leadership. But also similar to when I talked about execution smells, I also try to be observant in the organization, and to the extent that I can observe some of these things and try to intervene. I think the first one is, I think being super clear about the priorities that we're driving. And those, again, should be limited to a handful, because if you have too many, then it's not really a priority in that respect. And why is this important when we talk about burnout? Because it really helps you make sure that you're focused on the right things and that you're spending most of the energy that you have on these. At least in my personal experience, where I've experienced burnout in the past is where I try to spread myself in some sense too thin, trying to do way too many things, and ultimately most of them kind of fall sideways because of that. So I think for me, one of the key antidotes is basically to make sure that we're super clear on the priorities there. And that also makes you so that as you get, for example, additional workload, etc., you're able to prioritize it in that respect. I think the second one, which is also tied to the first one in that respect, is realizing like there will always be way more work than you're capable of basically addressing. And so for me, early on in my career, I used to think that, hey, my measure of success is how much of all the work that's on my plate I'm able to do as quickly and as good as possible. But clearly that definition, as sort of the demands for my time grew and my seniority grew, would literally run you to the ground if you keep with that definition. So I think one of the other key aspects of dealing with what I would call like sustainable performance has really been around how do you pace yourself, saying that like, no, not every project is going to get finished today. Not every email is going to get answered today. And learning to be okay with that. So how you develop essentially the muscle to basically, and the judgment to basically tell what's truly important has to be done today and what can wait till tomorrow, because there's always tomorrow, and tomorrow is another day for you to pick things up, would be number two. And I think number three is just being mindful of, again, compensating, like it's all about impact and not hours. Making sure that you as a person and then your team also, like, are you disconnecting after hours? Are you basically over the weekend, recharging, taking your vacations, etc. And really making sure that as a team, we guard our culture in the sense that, for example, even simplest things like don't send an email on a weekend or after hours, unless it's really time sensitive. Otherwise, either use the send later function or send it the next day. Similarly for chat messages and stuff like that. So I think sometimes these small things added up make a difference. And I feel like as a leader of an organization, it's also my responsibility to make sure that I look for these things and call them out, because sometimes, in some sense, the signal that you send, even if at times it may be just you look at it and you don't do anything, inadvertently sends a signal in the organization that that's okay, when in a lot of cases it's not. So taking a stance there helps. I hope these things help. And so at least these are a few things that have helped me in the past.
Thank you for this. This was really insightful.
Omar, I'm back. I don't know if you can see me. Basically,
I can't see you, but
TLDR.
I can hear you.
Okay, full power went out. No lights, no AC, no internet. The only thing that's working is my mobile phone. I
Got it.
see you've kept it going, so we can turn
Sure.
this into a fun Q&A for the next 15 or so minutes. Okay, so let's see. If anyone has a question for Omar, feel free to.
There is one question I want to ask Omar.
Yeah.
So I do follow you on LinkedIn. Sometimes I do jump in and comment. So I know you lead a high performance team and you're a thought leader. There are many things you do. How do you keep your energy up all the time? So that is one thing I want to know.
Sure. So I think definitely, listen, I would say that you don't always like, I always feel that motivation is fleeting. At times, I'm highly motivated, obviously, by my purpose in terms of what I do. But again, motivation is fleeting and not always reliable. So for me, discipline and focus on consistency has been a key part of what I do. And so, for example, as you mentioned, say as simplest thing as like LinkedIn, for example, whether it's writing content or engaging, there are days where I'm literally like, for example, at the end of the day, I'm not feeling as energetic, but I also know that, hey, my community is out there. People are taking the time to engage with my post. So there I lean on discipline to say, no, I do want to go in. And usually after I do that, as I get started, I feel like my energy kind of picks up and re-energizes me to get going. But I feel like that balance for me in terms of the discipline and motivation really helps in that respect. Because again, motivation kind of comes and goes. If you only rely on that, it's very difficult to achieve high performance consistently. And that's where discipline comes in. But fundamentally, though, you have to have a strong purpose towards what you're doing. And so for me, for example, all the work I do on LinkedIn is really as a means to pay it forward for all the support and help I've gotten throughout my career. And when you have that deep sense of purpose in that respect, I think it helps you dig deeper. But discipline is also important. So I feel like the duality of these things is what keeps me performing at this level.
Okay, thank you.
I see Krishna, you have a question. Go for it.
Yes, yeah, Jason, you're going to cover the cross-functional Acumen and the stakeholder engagement. So I'm curious to hear from Omar, how you navigate this cross-functional challenges and what strategies you use to engage stakeholders from different areas of Amazon. Yeah, if you could share some, I'll be interested to know that.
I'm happy to maybe share a few thoughts there since we've turned it into more Q&A, Jason, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So I think when I look at it in terms of cross-functional engagement, influence, whatever area that you want to mention under that, I think for me, one of the key things that it starts with is understanding sort of the lingo of the underlying function that you're trying to influence or work with, and also understand their key objectives and goals. I feel like that's so foundational to having a constructive conversation. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, I'm working with my finance business partner, obviously understanding, our financials, our metrics, what our objectives are for the year, what the contribution target we need to hit, what contribution profit target, what operational profit target do we need to hit, etc., are all things that I need to spend the time and effort to learn so that when I'm having a conversation with them, I'm able to speak to them in a way that they understand, they appreciate. And when your sort of partner on the other side sees that you're taking the time to understand what they do and what matters to them, I think that builds the rapport and the connection and really opens the door for you to be able to influence them for whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I feel like that's one important element. I think the second important element is also to think about your job in terms of educating others about basically the opportunities and the challenges that you see. I think oftentimes we think about influence as you're trying to push your ideas onto others, whereas the way I look at influence is more like you're trying to pull people towards your ideas. But you cannot pull others towards your ideas if they don't even understand the space or the opportunity or the challenge that you have. And by the way, like understanding the space doesn't mean necessarily that they agree with the proposal that you have, but at least if they understand the opportunity or the challenge, they may even suggest other solutions that may help you get there. And so for me, that's where I look at, like, how are you taking the time to educate them about that, I think becomes important. And then, of course, the last piece I'll add is also always seek to add value to their function or what they're trying to deliver. I think, for example, like let's say with my sales team, if there's ever maybe a deal that's hinging on the fence and I'm able to go say talk to the CTO or the head of technology at one of our merchants, I'm happy to do that to help them. And so these small things, small acts of goodness that you bring really showcases that you're also like a team player and you're not just solely focused just on your function, and really helps build that rapport and trust. So again, I think a lot of it revolves around investing in that relationship in a way that drives value, because that then opens the door for you to work effectively with them, to influence them with ideas that you have, and to basically maximize your impact overall.
Omar, let's treat this as round one. So we'll need to do a proper round two follow-up at a later date. Kate has a good question in the chat. How do you maintain high performance when your team or company goes through a reorg, especially the reorg after the reorg? How do you handle that?
Sure. I hear you. I think obviously challenging situation. There's no sort of sugarcoating around it. I think the first one that at least comes to my mind is basically like sitting down with the team and sharing the facts as they are, in terms of like you're not trying to, in some sense, sugarcoat anything or make things appear more positive than they are, but really just sharing the facts and for the team to hear it directly from you in terms of where you are. I think then is to bring out that, I think as a leader, your role is to bring in, let's say, positivity and optimism to the team in terms of like, we always, at least I always believe that things will work out for the better moving forward. And again, we all don't know what we don't know, but at least that's the general philosophy or approach that I approach it with, including controlling what we can control. And so I think bringing that positivity and optimism to help bring focus into what's controllable, because that's the only thing that we can do, I think helps set the team in the right mental model. Then it's about looking at our goals. What adjustments do we need to make? Do we still have what we believe is the right strategy? And how are we executing against it? So I think once we accept the facts and we move forward, we try to look forward, because always if you kind of keep looking back and second guessing yourself, etc., I don't think it's conducive to a good team dynamic there. Obviously, again, harder said than done, but I think it's very important as a leader to kind of bring that energy. And I think the focusing on your own energy and getting in the right space is very important, because again, it's highly contagious and your team can sense that. So if you're trying to convey optimism and positivity and you're not basically demonstrating that or showcasing that with yourself, it will be very difficult for you to expect that your team does that on themselves. So I hope that helps.
I will say in this situation, Ethan talks a lot about leaders being able to real-time pivot and be flexible. And I think this is a great example of Omar doing that with a structured chat that's turned into an open-ended Q&A. I'm going to check if anyone else has a question. If not, Omar, we got some pretty good pre-submitted questions I'll go through. We could treat this as a quick fire round. So question one, how do you develop a high-performing data team that is not seen as a real strategic partner? Or how do you get this team a seat at the table? Thoughts there?
Sure. I think for me, in terms of like when I think about the term seat at a table, I always think of it as like this is something you earn, not something that's necessarily given in that respect. And I feel like the way that you earn it, going back to the cross-functional acumen that we talked about, is really around understanding like who your key stakeholders are and really taking the time to listen and understand their priorities, and then figuring out how do you make sure that you're channeling your energy and the work that the team is doing in line with those priorities. I think as you start to drive value for your stakeholders in a way that aligns with the strategy, I think that earns you the right to be at the table. And again, I think it helps build that trust as well. So that would be kind of the way I would approach it, whether it's a data team or any other team in that respect. I feel, the same dynamics apply.
I agree. To build on that, it's interesting. Ethan and I did a chat with a data science class recently, and this question comes a lot from data science specifically. And the key feedback was, how do you turn from a cost center to a profit center? And it's by in a data science team specifically, it's by providing insights that impact the business directly. So to answer that question, that's the add-on. Omar, second question here, and this builds on what you just said. How do you form cross-discipline or functional relationships if there is not a shared incentive to work together in the short term, but you think there's potential long-term? What do you do?
Sure. I think for me, first adopting, like as said in the question, is like a long-term mindset of thinking of this as an investment. Like you want to start investing in that relationships. I think building that connect one-on-one definitely helps. But I think it's also about figuring out, what, let's say, shared goals that you can perhaps take that help you advance your priorities while also helping advance the priorities of the other functions. And I think the shared goal mechanism is a great way to basically put, in some sense, skin in the game and help build that trust. I feel like it's probably one thing that I've adopted and found to be super helpful in kind of bringing teams together and functions together to collaborate there.
I like that. Ethan and I always say that there's two things that are very true, like death and taxes. It's incentives matter and skin in the game matter. So if you hit those two, I agree to what you said. The third question here is, you have senior leaders that you report to, but they're new, either in their role or to the company. How do you influence them considering the new relationship?
Sure. I would say that one of the first things that at least I try to do whenever there's a new leader is basically be very proactive in helping them understand the area that I manage, the opportunities, and also the challenges that we have. I generally don't rely on them coming and asking me or, discovering these things as they go along. So I think taking the time to help educate them, I think is very important. So make it a priority and be proactive in doing that. Because again, going back to a point I raised earlier, you cannot influence others if they don't understand what you're dealing with in that respect. As you do so, though, I would say that make sure that you're prioritizing what's important and impactful for them to know now versus later, because it's also easy to swing on the other spectrum and just go with them with everything. And obviously they're still new, they're still ramping up. A lot of what you may have to share may not be relevant at this very point in time there. And make sure that as you present these things, communicate them in a way that is conducive to them in terms of language, the goals, the impact, etc. I think helps in that respect. And then once you have that, then in some sense, you keep building on it incrementally, little by little, and lean on compounding with you executing and delivering for you to earn their trust. And if you have that understanding and you have that trust, influence will come. But also be patient as part of it as well.
I like your mix of be proactive, wait on them, but also you have to be patient in this situation, which is the candid truth. There's one other pre-submitted question. You manage leaders. What is, the competition to get promoted is high. What are two things you recommend to someone to focus on if their goal is to get promoted to a director level at any company, let's say?
Sure. So I think for me, what kind of maybe separates out, a senior manager from a director is typically, like, for a senior manager, you get to that level and you're rated as highly effective in that level if you're able to deliver, at scale and consistently, right? So that earns you basically the seat at the table. I think for me, when you think about director, obviously that delivery aspect is now considered, if you will, table stakes to get there. I think the point becomes I think the 2 or 3 things that you need to focus on is, one is, how are you learning and understanding and shaping where the business is going, and be able to relate that to your specific function that you're leading. So if you're leading the technology function, is how are you understanding, like, where the business is headed, and then what technology investments do we need to start making now, so that as the business grows, for example, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years from now, we look back and say, like, hey, the technology has kept up the pace to enable the business, and conversely, it doesn't become essentially an inhibitor to business growth, or for the business to be able, for example, to go to other countries or scale to more users, or whatever the dimension may be, I think is one. I think to be able to do that, obviously, a lot of what we talked about already in terms of developing the cross-functional acumen becomes super important, because at that level, you can think of yourself as you're in the board of director of that company, of that organization that you're running. So your role is no longer just about technology. It's really like you're a leader, you're a shareholder, you're a board member in this organization. And so for you to understand what's happening, to contribute, to advocate, to challenge, and to be able to influence decisions, you need to develop that cross-functional acumen, whether it's the financial direction we're going, the product direction that we're going, the marketing direction that we're going. You need to develop a point of view that, again, it's like I always think of at that level, you're wearing 2 hats. There's the hat of your functional area that you're driving, but the other one is like, you're an owner in this company or a leader in this company, and it's your role to make sure that we're making the right decisions overall. It's not like, hey, this is marketing's job, or this is business development's job. This is all related to you in some way, shape, or form. And then the last thing I would say is, at that level, given again that you're removed from the immediate front line, I feel like your job as a director is really to be the steward of what I would call like the culture of your organization, the standards that you set. What friction are you removing from the organization? How are you designing your organization? So that really it's about shaping the environment so that the team members that you have on your team are able to perform at their very best. And so I take a lot of time and energy to really think about how am I making that happen at scale within the organization. I feel is a big element of that, because then I know for a fact that I lean on my team, on my next level leaders, etc., to be able to deliver. But these elements have to be right. So shaping that environment becomes very important.
I love that perspective of see yourself as part of the board of directors. That's a great line. We're at time. I'm going to save the rest of my questions for round 2, whenever we do that. But Omar, is there anything that this group can help you with?
No, first of all, I appreciate all the engagement on this session. I think a lot of great questions that have been asked here. I would say, if you don't already follow me on LinkedIn, please drop me a message. Would love to connect. If there's any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer. I feel like I learn a lot from the content that I post, by the engagement that I get from others, the inputs, etc. So please share your perspectives. Would love to learn more from you.
I'll say 2 things for Omar. Number 1, follow him on LinkedIn, because the advice he puts out is insightful. But number 2, take it a step further. When you write comments to Omar's post, sometimes, Omar, I find your responses to even be more insightful, because you have a skill in being able to summarize and distill insights into very crisp sentences. It's a powerful, effective communication skill. So I think for everyone else on that call, when you do the written, virtual, back and forth commenting with Omar, it'll help develop that muscle for you as well. So a pro tip there from me. But Omar, thank you for your insights. Thank you for your flexibility with the real world issues of Zoom. And we'll look to round 2 in the future. But thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Jason, for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for attending and for the great conversation there. Take care.
Thank you,
All
Omar.
right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.